right, so I want to tell a story about my youth, and I think it will tell you a little bit about myself, and in particular, perhaps the reasons why you might want to listen to what I got to say in reference to role-play games. So when I was a little boy, first of all, my dad and my family is from Midwestern Kansas, and as such, he was pretty much a country bumpkin. His terminology, his word usage, and such just befit that role of being a Midwestern farmer's kid. At any rate, when I was small, my dad would get frustrated with economies, as grown-ups will do, as many of us are today, and he would utter a phrase that just completely left me mystified. Now, this is, of course, when I'm 4 and 5 years old, so you wouldn't expect me to be able to follow, world politics or economic concerns of a country, or even the microscopic needs of a family of 4. But my dad used to just get so frustrated with things, and then he would exasperatedly throw his hands in the air and just say, "Emmett Scott gets. Emmett Scott gets." And for a long time, I pondered over that term. This poor individual, I don't know why Emmett Scott seemed to get everything, but it used to really bother me. So one afternoon, I called on my dad, said, "Dad, I got to ask you a question." Yeah, I said, "Why don't you just go over to Emmett's house and tell him what for?" And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you get angry every week, and you look at the grocery bill or look at the rent bill, and you just get really mad at him. And I think it would probably be better if you just talked to Emmett and got this fixed." And he goes, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, he's got everything. Whatever it was you had, whatever it is you were trying to achieve, Emmett got, and that doesn't seem fair." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Dad, every week you keep saying Emmett Scott gets, and I'm tired of it. I want you to go get it back from him." Well, I'm Jonathan Alvin, and this is NycosRPG, and you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. But welcome to NycosRPG. Today we're going to be talking about exploring backstories, enhancing your D&D game, your role-play game in general, and how to flat out make your life much more pleasing and to prevent the Emmett Scotts of the world of getting everything. So let me go into this a little bit further. Of course, Emmett Scott gets is a mishearing, malapropism, I believe is the term, not on the person speaking's part, but on my auditory and my intellectual awareness at the time. It's a I think it's malapropism. Emmett Scott gets is really the phrase, "them that's got gets," and that is referring to those that have everything get more. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, in just a small phrase. Emmett Scott gets. So just as I was misfiring my frustration with Mr. Emmett Scott when he had nothing to do at all with my dad's problems, is exactly what I perceive happening in the game world today, when people are concerned with their players' backstories, and or the players are frustrated equally with their own backstories. And so we're going to talk today about how to perhaps reconfigure the mindset about the concept of a backstory, and maybe clear the air so that poor Emmett Scott doesn't get any more grief. But of course, before then, we have to do our obligatory appeal to you as viewers. NycosRPG, as you may know, is a developing toolkit for game masters to improve the play experience of their games groups, and in the long term, perhaps providing you with an alternate mechanism to make all of your role-play game systems run more smoothly. As such, this channel is dedicated to role-play in particular and making your games go better. That's the reality is that my goal in life is to improve the number of people that are playing role-play games in specific and in games overall. And I want to mention that the Nykos mechanism is a skills-oriented, percentage-based system that is quick and easy to use. It's the fastest system to go from comprehending the concept of role-play to actually being in the game, taking less than 5 minutes for the average player. It provides dialogue-driven action and cinematic visualization capabilities in a theater of the mind environment. It's definitely not your clumsy old system, and although that was not the purpose for the name Nykos, it's a pretty darn good acronym. Of course, in 20 years, this might be an anachronism, but just realize that the difference between a system utilizing NycosRPG and one that is not, the difference is just a lot more fun. All right, getting past the screen to this one. Alrighty, so as a lifelong game master, I have more than 50 years of experience in the game, Dungeons and Dragons in particular, and another 5 or 6 in classic card games or board games even before that, dating my way back to when I was 4. But this lifelong experience with role-play games, it kind of hit me for a loop in the early days of 3rd iteration when players started to discuss the backstory. And at the time, I just put the B and the S to different use and was challenged by it. It's like, if we're playing a role-play game and you're playing a persona, why do we need to pursue what happened before? Because the whole point of the story is the adventures that we have together. But in that quick dismissal of backstories, I think I may have missed the target a little bit. And so what I'm going to do today is try to rectify that and try to explain how you as a player can improve the quality of your backstory, the depth and the intensity of it, and at the same time unwind some of the problematic issues that a veteran like I have with the backstory. Now, if you are a game player, if you already are a role player, you're familiar with the concept of the backstory. The idea is that when you build your persona that you're going to be playing in the game, whether you call it a character or a persona or an alt ego, whatever you want to call it, this persona has to start at some point intellectually. You know that there's always a beginning to a story. But when you do that, and you create, generate, or develop your persona, quite often it's hard to pick a specific starting point. And so therefore, games like Dungeons and Dragons in particular, and others of its same ilk, determined that it was easier if the players didn't have to explain precisely what happened before that. You know, where you have to go all the way back to childhood to build your persona. You could build it as an adult, but then you would develop its backstory. Now, this does relate back to advanced Dungeons and Dragons. In the time period of advanced D&D, players would build their persona and then wonder, what did we do? What were we doing? What was our career path at the moment when we became a persona, a character? And most games, when you're actually looking at your first creation, are looking at that character as something two-dimensional, flat on the page. It's a set of numbers that you're going to use to moderate action, but it's really seen almost like a playing piece. It is a part of the game, but it's not something that the player needs to become involved with. But it didn't take very long for players to determine that actually they wanted to connect with the persona they were playing. They wanted to get a handle on what that person was beforehand. And so Dungeons and Dragons, specifically the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons book, included an entire list of, I believe it was done out of determination by period, but they picked a general point in history to be the center point of the medieval period, and then they rattled off, I think it was like 20 years, I think it was 20, maybe 30 different careers, jobs you might have been experienced in doing beforehand. So things like farmer, barber, cobbler, handyman, etc. And they would create this list of they call them secondary skills. And they did that, I think, mainly because they didn't want to pursue a skills-based mechanism in their game. They were looking at it, as I've described before, as far more of a military-focused game. And so when they would create this list of secondary skills, then the players could satisfy themselves by saying, okay, I was a farmer, and that would be it. That way you would know that you came from a certain place and you were the son of a farmer. And it didn't take long, though, for game masters to see an angle in having that occupation, because now we have a way to bring a person into the story more tightly or more clearly if we link into that previous existence. So you have an adventure where you take the people back to their hometown, and then you introduce them to the people they might have known, and do so in such a fashion that, of course, the player feels a little forced to interact because it's his backstory, but he doesn't know it. He doesn't know who he knows. And so as time passed and the story angle became more important, and players also were beginning to see that their personality, the person that they were becoming in the game, did have possibly friends and interaction with family, and may have had a home, and maybe even might have had a future if they'd have stayed there. And so therefore the game masters would kind of encourage the players to dig into backstory. Well, Dungeons and Dragons, as it moves forward into later editions, the company saw opportunity to build up more of what they were looking for. Dungeons and Dragons for decades has been wrestling with the concept of IP, because the mechanism for the game initially, and I'd argue all the way into the 5th edition, was built specifically for game masters like myself to build my own story and to create my own lore. And so therefore, since they didn't have their own, they wanted to find a way to incorporate their viewpoints into the persona of the characters, thereby enticing the players to make more purchases of product within the fictional realm of the Dungeons and Dragons world. That is, to purchase items of their lore track. And by the time we get to the release of the very first of the expansions into the 5th edition with the Adventures in Phandelver, we are seeing a specific set of parameters being established. And so the backstory starts to become integral to player character development. So in other words, if you are going to build a character of a certain class, you must have a background from one of these selections. Now, they put it into the rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5e. I think they did it initially altruistically. They really were trying to make it so that players did not have to feel obligated to build backstory for their worlds, because a beginning game master hasn't gone through the World in Around 80 Days series that I'm creating, or any other mechanism to figure out how to do world building. And so to ask a brand new fledgling game master to suddenly open their mind up to what happened even before the story started is problematic. So they initially at least put those backstory hooks into the writing of the characters for, as I said, altruistic purposes. Now, move forward another decade, and we're now 5th edition is well established. They've got multiple properties out there, additional new classes, which means more angles on the future in the character class development mechanism, which therefore begs the question of where did they come from, adding possibly new backstories or enhancing the ones that are there. And I think it's really quite telling that the majority of them in Dungeons and Dragons specifically are set up to create personas with broken psychology. I'm not a psychologist. I don't even play one on TV, although I have RP'd them several times. But what I do know of psychology is that the individuals who have horrible challenges in their backgrounds are also prone to having challenges in their real life, and therefore that gives the persona, the character, permission to act out or be unruly or whatever. And I think that's one of the first problems. So we're going to look today at backstories through perhaps a narrowing lens. We're going to go through what I see too much of and too little of in story backgrounds in the time periods when I was running Dungeons and Dragons explicitly. Then at the end, I will also lean back to NycosRPG and how we have averted this issue altogether. And I invite conversation with you. I'm here on Twitch twice a day, and so during the times that I'm on air, I am willing to field conversation questions, even if they're not on the topic that I am talking about. So feel free to reach out and leave a message here. If you're watching this on our rebroadcast on YouTube, that's not really rebroadcast, it's a copy of the show. But if you're watching there, make sure you leave your questions in the comments, and I pledge to respond to them in an upcoming video. My plan is to eventually build up some AMA episodes where I do nothing but answer questions, but to date that hasn't been a difficulty or a challenge to deal with. So feel free to leave the comments and we'll try to resolve them. Alrighty, so when we are talking about backstories, and pardon me for putting my glasses back on, but I have this weird desire to be able to read from time to time. But when we're talking about backstories, the big question is, what's the problem? What's so bad about a player character's backstory? Especially if it makes them feel better about the persona build that they're running, why would you find a challenge with that? So we're going to go into this in a kind of a little, I'm trying to be lighthearted about it by going too little, too much, too little, too much. So I think you'll see that trend here. So the first thing I say is there's too little imagination. And that sounds horrible, because that sounds judgmental, that I would be arguing that a player who has a backstory has too little imagination. But I'm not referring to that. When I speak of a backstory, I say that it provides too little imagination. And what that means is it gives answers to the questions that a person who's playing a character might have, and thereby depriving them of their ability to imagine. For example, if someone says, well, in my backstory, I was abandoned as a child. Well, gosh, about every one of us has had some point in our life where we've had abandonment, and some of us develop entire cultural issues of abandonment issues and such like. But that, to me, doesn't afford the player enough information for them to actually choose the direction they want to go. And it starts the process of compartmentalizing, isolating, and actually blocking out the persona so that there isn't as much imagination required from the player. Now, that also sounds harsh because it's required of the player. But the reality is we are playing a game here. We are investing in a fictional setting. We're not buying into an actual historical place where you have to, memorize lore and data about the persona you're playing. You don't have to do any of that. And because of that, because it's not bound in such a fashion, the idea is that your imagination should be able to run wild. Maybe you had a perfect childhood. The question of why a persona leaves to go adventuring, in most games, it's assumed that they are forced to. Either economically so, because they don't have any money, or politically so, because they are the illegitimate child of someone else who is powerful and will cause them harm. Or generally, the majority of backstory triggers, if you will, are negative. They're the idea of what causes the adventuring to occur becomes an anchor instead of a balloon, so to speak. It does not elevate, but rather it drags down the persona. Now, the reason why it requires too little imagination, or the reason why this blocking out is a bad thing, is that because of the other side of the coin, which is there's far too much overbleed. We consider things like I'm abandoned by my parents to be a horrible thing, because in our world, helicopter parents exist, and there is no way that a parent would intentionally leave us. And while, yes, it does happen, I know that there's going to be psychological commentary across the board on how dare I make generalizations. But the reality is that there's far too much cultural overbleed in these backstories, because we are imposing on a persona in a fictional setting, not even necessarily even on Earth, with the burdens of the way we perceive these actions to be. One of the odd things I remember from my historic studies when I was a little boy was the reality that in Rome, all the way up to, I believe it was 6 years old, if a parent could not support their child, they were permitted to chain them to the front doorpost of their homes and leave them. And anybody else cruising down that road who had some extra, as the saying goes, ruples in their pocket, or whatever they had lira in their pocket, and could afford the extra mouth to feed, were permitted to take that child in legal enslavement. And of course, our culture couldn't possibly even think that way. I mean, we have enough of a war going on just in issues of reproductive rights as it is, so I'm not even going to go there. But the idea of abandonment, about the concept of physical crimes that have been visited upon in the backstory, captivity, imprisonment, all these things that are horribly triggering in our world are being forced into the fantasy setting because of overbleed, because we are bringing in our own baggage. I'll get more into that a little bit later, but just realize that when we speak of the lack of imagination and the overbleed, what we're doing is we are actually replacing something that is imaginative with something that is imitative. We're bringing in boxes of emotion, boxes of trauma, of danger, and we're laying them on the persona right from the get-go, and that's problematic to me. Our next Too Little Too Much has to do with the player and the character they're playing. In role-play games, you are tasked, if you will, as the player, with inserting yourself into the story and becoming mechanistically associated with the persona. Matter of fact, many game masters, such as myself, will call for a player to speak in the first person when their persona, their character, is involved in the scene, in order to more tightly connect the player with their character. And again, I'm probably stepping on some toes here, so again, please leave me a comment if I am, because I'd love to have that conversation. But the concept that a player should remain disconnected from their persona isn't referring to the action portion of the roleplay game, but on the interconnection. And we'll talk about that from a player danger location here in a moment. But right now what I'm referring to is that when you build a backstory that isn't your own personal backstory, and you enforce that on the persona, you are putting yourself automatically at a disadvantage when it comes to playing that persona. You are disconnecting yourself. Now, some would argue that it is role play to have to role play with that drama, but I respond to that by saying that would be the case of a method actor, not necessarily of a character actor. And I believe that role-playing games are big enough to embrace all types of RPG intention. So the idea of there not being enough interconnection between the player and his perceived persona builds in stressors that don't need to be there. I know I'm talking like a professor. I get in trouble for this all the time. I don't say to the task. But the idea here is that a person who is too little interconnected with their character can't make sound character decisions. Instead, they're going to do third party, and that is the idea of not what would I do, but what would I do if I were you. And that nuanced difference really is key to the difference between playing a role-playing game and playing a video role-playing game. Don't get me started. All right. There's definitely too little interconnection. But notice also, especially a very deep and rich backstory provides the opportunity for too much preloading. Sure, you're now looking at the persona as somebody who's outside of yourself, and therefore that persona can carry all of this extra baggage. So you start throwing in, well, yes, he had problems with his childhood, but then he had this uncle and blah, blah, blah. And you start to answer the very questions that the backstory is supposed to create. A game master's role is to give the players a life in their role as a character. Some argue that it's less about that and more about the isolated telling of a specific story, as in a one-shot adventure, and there's grounds for that argument. But when I speak of this concept of preloading, when you give the persona the answers to those questions, it takes away from the game master's ability to get a grip on, get a connection with, link in that persona to the story that is being told. And so, from a player perspective, preloading feels good because it answers those niggling questions that are in the back of your mind that developed as you were building the character in the first place. But it detracts from your ability to be that persona in the ongoing, because you can't relate, because all the baggage that was put there is not stuff that you personally have experienced. And if it is, then that's going to be a completely different issue, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Howdy, Gene. How are you doing? So this concept of the backstory being too preloaded does seem to counteract the too much interconnection, but I remember I said too little interconnection. I want the players, and game masters want their players to be able to associate themselves into the story and insinuate them into the action directly. And we're coming up on the half hour, so I've got to do my obligatory callback. So Do remember that the mechanism that supports this is NycosRPG. It's a skills-based system, arguably the quickest learning mechanism in the game, and it is a toolbox usable in whatever game form that you play. If you want more information, check out NycosRPG.com, and we will continue back to our show. Alrighty, so the next thing we're going to talk about is a backstory provides the persona with too little curiosity. When a person plays a character, when they step into the role in the new realm that they are stepping into, they should be fairly bursting with questions. A new player will be, concerned with, how do I accomplish certain mundane tasks? Is it possible to put myself in any kind of danger? What are the boundaries? How far can I run? How high can I jump? The physical stuff. A more sophisticated player, once they step into the role, if they've built a huge backstory, they've answered a lot of the questions that the game master really would be the one to help you answer. For example, how did you get along with your parents? Well, we don't know. You didn't meet your parents because your parents aren't people that you created. The people that are your parents are going to be someone that the game master creates. So that's really not a fair question to even ask the player. Ask the game master to provide. There's not enough curiosity about relationships. If you've written in that you have a lost love, and then, the best that the game master can do is try to create the thread up to attach that love to. The idea of creating either the memories, which are fundamentally just temporally displaced adventure encounters, if you think about it. But the idea of solving all of the problems that your persona presents at the beginning is a disservice to you as a player, and also a disservice to the story as it isolates the player from it. Ironically, this concept of too little curiosity can also be associated with too much baggage. Many times the elements that people put into their backstories are a form of wish fulfillment. They're hoping to reach back into the past and have you as game master cherry pick pieces from what they've created as the story, and then sprinkle those little pieces across the game to give them more security and more of an anchor. Whereas simply ignoring or realizing that you don't know the backstory is far more effective in doing that. And if the players want to retroactively go back and play a scene of the past, it certainly makes sense for the game master to be included in that, because he's going to be running all of the personalities that you as a player would want to interact with. So by failing, we've got a nice machine going in the background. The failing in providing curiosity to the player again promotes the idea of them being standoffish. I don't need to listen to this portion of the lore because my backstory already isolated. Fix that problem. I don't need to know what's going on in the Northland because I was told, according to my backstory that I've created, that my parents told me that I'm safe from any kidnapping or whatever. Whether that's true or not, that closes out the curiosity that the player might have about their origin, about who they really know. And conversely, or rather not conversely, but in addition, the backstory creates too much baggage. Literally, the anchors, the very pieces that make a backstory rich, and by definition, almost always makes it uncarryable. In other words, you as an NPC, you as a player character, have established that you are an adventurer of a certain class, certain background, and you've isolated yourself by your backstory from all these other things, but you've also put in compulsions. I must find my father. I must avenge the death of my sister. I must this or that. And all of these anchor pieces are indirectly almost commands to the game master that he then either has to completely ignore, which isolates you as a player, or he has to embrace, in which case he isolates his story from where you intended to be. Hey, Crazy Ways, thanks for joining us. I hope I could pronounce that right. Or Crazy W, yes, we'll just leave Crazy Ways. Hey, we'll do the little dance. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right, so when we're dealing, therefore, with the idea of too much baggage, the game master's obligation in accepting backstory has become kind of a punching bag. Many times players will build the gratuitously large backstory with many intentional targets as a means of pushing through their private agenda into the role-playing mechanism. In the case of game masters who pride themselves on being sandboxes, this is a problem because these anchors are now establishing facts not in evidence of the fictional realm. And it's for these reasons that the very idea of the backstory starts to feel like a burden. And when we get to NycosRPG and how it gets handled with that, I think you'll see it's a logical progression that makes absolute sense. But let's get back to this. The heavy baggage, the heavy burdens that are put in the game drive the story in a different direction than it was intended. And if you have several strong-minded players with very different perceptions of the backstory from their own perspectives, you can literally have groups tear themselves apart. I can't tell you how many times I've had a situation where after 8, 10, 12 weeks of playing together, 1 or 2 or 3 players say, well, I can't continue. This is... we're talking about role-play games, and Dungeons & Dragons in particular. Jean's trying to help you out, but she has a bit of neuropathy, so her fingers. She says, all RPGs in general, and in specific NycosRPG, but Nykos is kind of the toolbox solution, and I'll get more information when we get to the end of this. So until then, we're talking in particular about Dungeons & Dragons. I GM'd for D&D for 50 years, so it's been near and dear to my heart for a really long time. So, therefore, this is any RPG system that has backstory involvement. There are certain RPGs that don't. The way certain game masters run their stories also will preclude the backstory. But generally speaking, the idea of understanding where your character came from in terms of family, standing, economics, business opportunities, etc., becomes itself this bundle that I'm calling Backstories, or for short, BS. All right, so therefore a bundled group of backstory elements actually creates a situation where it gives too few tools. Don't say that too many times quickly, it'll mess with your mouth. Too few tools for a persona to develop identity. And in many ways, I think that identity is what we really mean when we talk about playing a role-playing character. We want to exist in the skin, so to speak, of this alternate person for whatever period that we are involved in the game. And one of the biggest, most important parts of that, I believe, is getting to be that person. And if you've created a backstory that isolated you, that puts you in a place where you either feel uncomfortable or really don't know much about, then you isolate yourself from the persona and make it harder to play that character. This idea of too few tools also refers to if you've precluded going to the church because something happened within the faith community, or precludes you from going to the police because you have a criminal background, or precludes you from dealing with things on a medical basis because you had a bad issue with somebody in the medical field. All of these seemingly clever backstory elements are counterproductive because they are keeping you from being able to say, I'm doing this or I would do that as the persona. And that's a danger. The irony is that this process of building it create too many smooth surfaces. To use that phrase, smooth surfaces, may not be understandable unless you're a game master, because the idea of stickiness or prickliness of a persona seems almost antithetical, right? You want a character to be lovable, friendly, open. But the irony is that in a hyper smooth, well thought out and well developed backstory, and I've seen some that are ridiculous. I've seen 17 pages of backstory for a single character, level 1. And literally that backstory was built specifically because the player, in the week, I think it was 2 weeks before they actually played the persona, was actually playing the persona. They were going through the situations in their minds that they had developed in their original brush of their persona. They saw the prickly bits. They saw the places where things didn't make any sense, where there were disconnects. And instead of leaving them there for the game master to pick up and run with and tie threads around and interconnect the persona, instead they slowly polished. A friend of mine would call it polishing a turd, but that's not me. They polished this story to a fine shine, and so that when they show up at the game, they're perfectly fine because they have now built all the boundaries they need so that the story that the game master has to tell can't touch them. And thereby they've made themselves isolated from the game session. And so when I speak of a smooth surface, what I'm referring to is they've taken out any method or means for the game master to even connect in a tiny way this persona to the world, and therefore it's easier for the player to then speak of the character in the third person. This guy will do this. Well, I would say that. Then that person is going to say this and such, and therefore never actually step into the role, which kind of defeats the purpose for the role play in the first place. Now, I do want to mention something very quickly. If you've noticed down at the bottom, there are a couple of phrases that I put on the screen, and I did this a couple of days this week. Those are clues to a trivia question I'm going to ask at the end of this episode. And if you already know the film, which you probably do if you recognize the terms here, or if you have them, the same ones from the other day, in this episode I'm going to ask the trivia question, and whoever is the first to post in the YouTube channel the solution, the answer to this, in any of my videos. If you're watching this one and you want to go put it in earlier, you can put it into any video. I'll be looking at the timestamp. But I'm not going to do the question until after we've gotten past the first hour. So in this case, the terms that are listed are clues to the trivia. Yes, thank you, Gene. Hooks and loops on Velcro surfaces, mainly the hooks. If you make them all loops, that's okay too, but that means you're going to feel a little bit jerked because I'm going to be yanking you in a direction. Whereas if you're the one who has the story questions that you have in your backstory or in your origin point, then you're desiring to be pulled in, and therefore it's not as abrupt or jarring. But the idea is that if you made it too smooth, it can't be worked with. So my recommendation is, if you have to go for a backstory, brevity is the soul of wit. 1, maybe 2 lines tops should cover it. We'll get more to that in a bit because we'll talk about how to build a backstory. But we've got a few more things to go over. If it's too smooth, then it doesn't have enough grippy bits. And I'm talking about grippy bits from the player's standpoint. If you've built your system so that even if there are loops to the outside, there are places where a game master can reach in and connect, you're not giving your persona a reason to be there. If you are playing the persona and you don't have a connection with the story as it's being developed on your own personal side, then your interaction will always be at arm's distance because you're going to be just choosing the pieces you want to draw yourself into instead of making it so that you're automatically drawn into the scenes. This is critically important when you're talking about a long tail game. Granted, if you play a lot of one-shot adventures, maybe you do some solo adventuring where you just literally run the story for yourself. I don't recommend it, but that might be your reality. If you don't make your characters susceptible to story hooks, and story themes, then you are putting yourself at risk of being literally cutting yourself out of the adventure. I have actually had people who have built persona who are so smooth bore, so to speak, that when I tell them the story hook, introduce them to the NPCs, provide evidence to why this is an important plight that has to be resolved, the characters still can just simply walk away because nothing here for me. Matter of fact, one of the what used to be the most hated phrase from a game player to any game master was the phrase, well, what's my motivation? What's my motive? Why am I here? And if you're building a persona that has this smooth bore, low grippy bit character, you're setting yourself up for fundamental failure because a game master is not going to be able to, literally they can, pardon the phrase, throw you into the adventure, but most people see that as railroading. If I'm forced to be here because you made me and there's no motive for me being here, then I don't want to play. And these all are fomented by extremely well thought out, well developed backstories. They can be a problem. The next, the irony here is that there are simply too many memory holes in a persona backstory. And what I mean by that is, let's say you did write a 17-page document. You've built out everything that happened from the age of 15 until the present. There's still too many memory holes. What happened on your 14th birthday? What happened when your sister broke her leg? What happened when your parents had that fight and your dad threw something? Remember any of those? Probably not. If your story did include those, then you're probably at 17 to 20 pages. And you're not providing an opportunity for the game master to weave you into the story, because one of the elements of a game master is finding ways to bring all players into the action. And so therefore, if you have too many memory holes, you can't feel connected to the persona because you can't remember those potentially critical moments of history that might have been useful in the story. But it also provides too few anchor points. And when I say anchor points, again, the prickly portions of a persona include things like, if you're a military personnel, are you currently employed? If your backstory says, yes, I'm currently employed, now the game master has to overcome a fact of the creation of your persona, and that makes it more difficult to anchor you into the story. If you were not employed, then it's a far easier job to say, hey, I've got occupation. So therefore, the depth of your backstory can be a burden in all areas. So now I've talked about all of this. I do want to go back and talk about Backstories from the different perspective, and that is of the Game Master Soapbox. But before I get to that, I do want to give you the we're not quite at the hour yet, so I'll go ahead and state the codes for those that are hearing the broadcast but can't see it. The clues for today are Blue Coat Irregulars and the name John Horfin. Now, you can put it directly into the chat if you think you know the motion picture, but that would only provide assistance to other players in this little contest. And if you're wanting to get a free copy of the Masterbook PDF, you'll want to keep that to yourself until I ask the trivial question, which will be after the end of the first hour. All right, so let's pop back over here. All right, so now Jonathan Albin is going to be Game Master, and I'm going to get onto my soapbox. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to NycosRPG and my game sessions. We are going to be building a persona in a few minutes, and that process does take a few dice rolls, or you can use a numeric system that I developed for quick play. We're not going to be using either in this demonstration that I'm doing because I'm only wanting to talk about the next portion of it, which is the building of your backstory. If you are building a backstory for your character, for your persona in this game, there are some questions you need to ask yourself first. And that is, number one, what do you know of the world in which we are playing? If we are, for example, in a game of role-play roulette, do you even know what the setting is? If you have an idea of a setting, that will give you some clues on how to build a backstory, but it doesn't really give you too much. Even if you have extensive experience in a role-play game of this specific genre. So in the case of Dark Shards, you're familiar with the high fantasy setting. You know something of the species of Nykos. You've done your homework and you've researched the various ways of developing your persona. But again, before you build the backstory, here are some more questions you need to be concerned with. Are you an only child, or do you have siblings? Do you know how many? How old? Are you in the middle, or are you beginning, oldest, youngest? Next question, why does that matter? If you're in certain large families, you could be the 17th brother and it doesn't matter. So realize that the stuff you want to put down in your backstory needs to be the parts that really matter to the story. But that also then begs itself into the next question, which is, where are you in this story? If you are a developed veteran and you have no desire for advancement, that's far, far different than a brand new person coming out of grade school. So I would hazard the warning to try to think about what the purpose of your backstory is. How much do you depend on those siblings, if you have any? And if you don't, who do you depend on? And if you don't depend on anybody, then again, what's the point of knowing that information? I could go on. The real question I have in building a backstory is, what is it that you are going to be deriving from that backstory as a player? Is it a connection with your entity, your persona? If so, how? What does having... I mean, if you're building the persona to be more like you, then that's not really playing a role, is it? That's actually being the role. And that's okay. It's just, if that's the case, then realize that you're not going to be gaining the depth of experience you might have in actual role play because you're not taking on somebody else's role. Realize that's really where the role playing came from, after all. The idea of building a persona who lives in a different world and does different things and had different backgrounds from you. In which case, we don't even know ourselves. I mean, I look at my life and I say, yes, I was related to people. I had parents and I had brothers and sisters. And when I was at home, I needed them. They were definitely part of my life. But at this point, all of them are deceased. All of my brothers and sisters, all of my sisters. I do have a half brother. If you're watching, bro, give me a call again. We haven't talked in a long time. But if, on the other hand, you have not dealt with your family in a while, why does it matter? The real point of this soapbox element is this. I am against the concept of building a backstory because the character that you are building is as much in the world that I've created as Game Master as it is your insertion of your personality. The person wouldn't exist without you, and neither would they without the world. So why don't we work together to figure out what you know and what you don't know about your prehistory? And if there are key elements in it that need to be there for some specific purpose that you as a game player wish to have at the table, that's fine. But that's an issue of our conversation as players in the game, not necessarily of a externally created mandate as a persona, as a backstory, so to speak. So I'm going to be getting off my soapbox here in a minute, but if you have a chance and you want to respond to this, just make sure that when you put in your comments, you put at Game Master Soapbox, so I know you're referring to this portion in particular, because I will be doing all questions answered right here too. So AQA, AMA, whatever you want to call it. So now I'll get back off my soapbox. Alrighty, so now we've talked about all these too little's too much is too little too much. If you notice that the too little too much does have a theme, and there is something that goes right down the middle of this, which is the just right backstory. And what I have found the elements of the just right backstory to include are fundamentally, as I mentioned in the soapbox, there's only about 2 or 3 sentences you really need to come up with for a backstory. You want to discuss what your backstory tells us about who you were, who you are, and who you want to be. Because when we have that description, who you are, who you were, who you are, and who you want to be, we have an idea of your existence as a being in transition. When we talk about, like, for example, particle physics, you're looking at the 3 velocities, right? How fast you're moving up, how fast you're moving left or right, and how fast you're moving up and down, left, right, and laterally. The point I'm trying to make is that the personality that you bring on into the game is better defined by that phraseology. So, for example, I was an orphan, I'm now a wanderer, and I hope to someday find a family. That tells me a lot, doesn't tell me too much, and gives me lots of hooks. I am the son of I'm the son of a wealthy family who lost everything, and I'm hoping to regain it. That's those kinds of was, is, and will be through lines give the game master enough to spin with, and as long as you keep, you continue to hold to that over time, that persona's progression will be down that definitional course that you were looking for. It's what you wanted as a player. You wanted to be included. You wanted to be swept away. You wanted to become more. Having said that, let me talk a little bit about NycosRPG, only to this point. NycosRPG as a mechanism has a rule established in it that all characters in the game are subjects to an injunction. And this injunction is to the point that you as a person playing the character did not create the character. It was already in existence and living its best life, so to speak, or worst life, until such time as you as the player insinuate yourself into the life of that persona. This injunction is visible not only to the family of your character, but it's also visible to other player characters and to those who knew you outside of your new reality. That is to say, we all know people in this world that are bright bulbs, that are going someplace, that have their life together. And we all endeavor to be like them at some level. And some of us are those bright bulbs who are doing exactly what they want to do in life, even if it's not to their full satisfaction. And in just that same fashion, the fact that you can see that in a person applies here. So your character in the game is already en route to being a champion of the world. The rest of the world can see it in you, and you're going to exude it just by your being. Having said that, the moment of transition, when you take up the role of the persona and you step into those shoes, you are tabula rasa. You have no connections with the world because you are new to it. And therefore, the world around you and your interaction with it will be based solely on your experiences in the game. That is to say, you may have you may have not written down a backstory, but you may already have brethren. You may already have parents. You may already have an occupation. You may already have all kinds of stuff. But until you discover that, it's actually a surprise to you as well. And that means that, yes, we can develop a backstory for you. We can drive the story into the histories to find out, where you used to live and that kind of thing, so that you can jog free those memories that you had hoped to find. But it does not make it so that those are primary drivers. It also leaves you incredibly sticky to the world because you're absolutely going to be curious about all those pieces you didn't build your backstory about. You're not going to have overbleed because the only thing you're bringing with you is you. And if you have those issues and you have those challenges and you want to interact with them in game, that's your choice. But it's not a mandate upon other players to have to handle in advance those issues. Maybe you did bring some personal emotional baggage, but you're not bringing too much because you don't have the anchor to hang it on in the backstory. And your ability to be a smooth orb is far less when you don't even know where the edges of the world are, and you need to be able to figure out where those boundaries are, and therefore you are interacting with the world point by point. The element of NycosRPG that really needs to be inserted into standard roleplay is that the concept of backstory shouldn't be a replacement for roleplay experience. And instead, I'd entice you to have your game master consider at least the concept of utilizing NycosRPG's idea of the injunction to at least keep those things stable. So now we're coming down to the question. All right, so you guys have seen these clues. Those of you that were on Monday and I believe Tuesday, you saw different clues. And those pointed to the reference. But, how do I want to word the question? Not like I don't already have it written down and I have to look it up or anything like that. But, I do remember what the other clues were. So the other clues, just for so you're aware. Well, no, I'm not going to do that. You have to go back and watch my other videos to find the other clues. Aha! So my question to you is, what was the name of Clancy Brown's character in this movie? What was the name of Clancy Brown's character in the movie pointed to by the references? And a bonus would be a bonus will be a copy of the CIS and persona sheets to be included in the master book setup for the winner. Bonus questions are: what are the fruits that are misplaced in the film? There are two. What are the fruits that are misplaced in the film? There may be actually more than 2 answers, but I can think of in particular 2 points where they were quite apparent and obvious. So, what was the name of Clancy Brown's character in the film to which these clues point? And what were the fruits that were distinctively placed, shall we say? Alrighty, so that will conclude my conversation with Backstories. The final version is, if you must tell the backstory, keep it to as few words as possible, 2 or 3 sentences predominantly. My recommendation is who you were, who you are, who you're going to be, or where you came from, where you are, and where you're going. That's all you really need to develop a backstory, notwithstanding those mechanisms that require much, much more. There are reasons why I stopped running Dungeons and Dragons, and I will link this video here at the end to that in particular video of why I quit game mastering Dungeons and Dragons. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to also thank you for your consideration of NycosRPG as a game toolbox. For more information about it, you can check out NycosRPG.com for information on myself as a storyteller and on the properties and the availability of the first few titles. The Kickstarter for the project will be later this year, so for more information on that, check out patreon.com/Nykos. And if you do join our Patreon program, you do gain access to 2 online stream games that we play on our Discord channel, and you get access to that as well. So, finally, like and subscribe. If you subscribe here on Twitch, you no longer have to see any commercials on my shows. So, that's a big benefit. And unfortunately, I can't offer that to the YouTube. For you, if you subscribe, you'll have my undying appreciation, and you will be counted as part of our community of Bright Sparks. So, we will see you again in a later episode. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this has been NycosRPG. We'll see you later.